I used to believe secrets were the stuff of thrillers, until I found myself clutching one so tightly it altered my entire life. This is my confession. I still remember the blazing heat of that July afternoon, the way the pavement shimmered under the sun as if the world itself were bending and warping, foreshadowing how my own reality was about to twist. My name is Ramona, and at 38 years old, I thought I had my life in neat order: a steady marriage with Daniel, a suburban home with flower beds meticulously arranged, and a routine that rarely shifted beyond small talk at dinner and the occasional Saturday night out. Everything felt calm and predictable, until I met Ezra, the 19-year-old who would wake parts of me I'd almost forgotten existed. I used to pride myself on my sense of stability. In my 20s, I was all about spontaneity, road trips, midnight visits to food trucks, adopting stray cats, you name it. But over time, that spark seemed to dim. My marriage with Daniel, once a flutter of excitement, had grown into a pattern. We functioned more like polite roommates than passionate partners. We scheduled our days with mechanical efficiency: morning jogs, separately, quick check-ins about bills, rotating who got the groceries each week. I convinced myself it was normal, that love evolved into comfort. Yet a small voice within asked if I was truly content, or simply avoiding the question. We had no children. At first, we said we needed to wait until finances felt secure. Then we were too busy, he with his corporate job, me with an administrative role at a local museum. Before I knew it, I was edging toward 40, no kids in sight, and an underlying emptiness creeping into everyday life. I told myself we were happy. Look at us, I'd think, no big dramas, no screaming matches. But sometimes no drama can be its own brand of quiet heartbreak. I'd volunteered to help organize a summer youth art program at the museum.
Teens from the neighborhood could come for free workshops: painting, sculpting, mixed media. The coordinator, Millie, was a friend of mine from the museum's education department. She roped me in for logistical tasks: phone calls, sign-ups, handling supply lists. I didn't mind. It was a break from my usual record-keeping job, and seeing young people excited about art reminded me of my own buried passion for creativity. Ezra joined as a volunteer assistant. He was introduced on the first day by Millie, who praised his dedication and artistic eye. I noticed him right away: tall, lean, with hair that fell over his forehead in a slightly messy wave. He carried a sketchbook everywhere, nibbling the end of a pencil like he was always on the verge of an idea. Millie said he was about to start community college and had been an enthusiastic participant in last year's teen workshop. Now he wanted to help, to pay forward what he'd gained. I remember giving him a friendly smile, thinking how sweet it was that someone so young cared about helping others discover art. He came off as shy at first, but polite. If I passed him a supply list, he'd nod, quietly complete it, and then return to me with a half smile. "Anything else, Ms. Ramona?" he'd ask. I'd wave him off, telling him just to call me Ramona. Ms. sounded too formal. He'd grin sheepishly, an easy warmth in his eyes. Over the course of the workshop, we ended up chatting about logistics: how many brushes each table needed, which sets of markers were dried up, that sort of thing. Then one afternoon, while most of the teens were absorbed in a painting session, we found ourselves alone in a back storeroom, rummaging through a messy shelf for more canvases. I cracked a joke about the museum's tendency to hoard ancient supplies. Ezra laughed, really laughed, full-bodied, and it struck me how long it had been since I'd shared a genuine laugh that reached my own eyes. We started talking about random topics: movies, favorite music, the local diner's amazing milkshakes. Suddenly, half an hour had passed. I realized I felt oddly rejuvenated just from that simple conversation. When I emerged from the storeroom, a piece of me wondered why a simple discussion with a teenager had left me so alive. As the days rolled on, Ezra and I gradually spent more time together. It was never planned, just stolen snippets of conversation while setting up easels or handing out supplies. He told me about how he grew up with two older sisters who teased him mercilessly, until he discovered drawing as an escape. I admitted that I once aspired to be an illustrator, but let practicality steer me into museum admin work. He perked up, urging me to dust off my sketchpad. I shrugged, dismissing the idea, but the seed was planted. I began noticing small details, how his eyes lit up when discussing an artist he admired, how he carried himself with a quiet confidence that belied his age, how the corners of his mouth curved into a smirk when he found something particularly funny. I scolded myself. Ramona, you're old enough to be his mother, nearly. But that wasn't quite true. We had about an 18-year gap, not decades upon decades. Still, it felt entirely inappropriate. I was a married woman, settled, approaching 40. Yet there was an undercurrent I couldn't deny, a tension that hummed whenever we ended up side by side. Daniel, meanwhile, was mostly absent from my thoughts. Our routine carried on at home, each of us so wrapped in day-to-day busyness that we barely noticed if the other was happy or sad. Occasionally, I'd feel a spike of guilt for the small thrill I got from talking to Ezra, but I told myself it was harmless. I was simply enjoying a nice rapport with a volunteer. Nothing more, right? One weekend, the museum hosted a small community festival. Our youth workshop set up a booth on the front lawn, displaying the teens' artwork. I was there from sunrise, helping Millie manage everything. Ezra showed up early too, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, carrying a tray of coffee for the staff. It was a kind gesture, one that made me smile too widely as he handed me a latte, complete with a swirl of foam on top. Throughout the festival, we were busy demonstrating quick crafts, welcoming families, and explaining the workshop's goals. By evening, the festival wound down. Millie left early for a family event, leaving me to close out the booth. Ezra stayed to help, saying he had no rush to be anywhere. We packed up art supplies, loaded boxes onto a small cart. The last of the festival goers trickled out, the sun setting behind the museum's spires. I remember wiping sweat from my brow, exhausted but oddly content. When we finally finished, the entire plaza lay still, lit by a few lampposts. I thanked him for the help, and he responded with something quiet, a bit hesitant. I was thinking, maybe we could grab a quick bite? I mean, only if you're free. You did so much today, I figure you must be starving. A simple invitation. But I felt my pulse speed up, torn between a mild alarm and a flutter of excitement. I checked my phone. A message from Daniel stating he'd be home late. No specifics. I looked at Ezra's hopeful expression and decided, as innocent as possible, to say yes. We ended up at a small taco stand near the Riverwalk, sharing an outdoor table. The lights reflected on the water, giving the evening an almost magical glow. Our conversation meandered. How the festival turned out better than expected, his dreams of maybe traveling to Europe one day to study art, my half-joking confession that I sometimes dreamed of dropping everything and learning to illustrate children's books. At some point, we both paused, noticing the heightened intimacy of the moment. I realized it was nearly 9 p.m., well past time I'd normally be home. Guilt tugged at me, but the gentle warmth of being truly listened to felt too intoxicating to dismiss. As we parted ways, we walked side by side along the dimly lit sidewalk back to our cars. Suddenly, a jolt of thunder rumbled in the distance. We laughed about the possibility of a random summer storm. Then, caught in a moment of strange closeness, we both turned to say goodbye at the same time. Our eyes locked, and for a split second, I thought he might lean in. My heart thundered in my chest, but he simply said, "Thanks for tonight, Ramona." His voice soft. I exhaled, murmuring, "Thank you too," and rushed to my car, mind swirling. Daniel noticed a shift, or maybe I inadvertently gave it away. Over the following weeks, I found myself more distant, preoccupied. I'd text an excuse about working late. He'd nod, barely looking up from his laptop. But one night, as I returned from a post-work dinner with Ezra, under the guise of finishing festival finances, Daniel was still awake. He asked how the finances went, eyes narrowing. I stammered a reply, red creeping to my cheeks. He frowned, but dropped the topic. At times, I tried to stoke some spark with Daniel, suggesting we go on a weekend trip or try a new restaurant. He'd shrug, preoccupied by an upcoming project deadline. Our marriage was stuck in a loop of, maybe next time, or, I'm just too tired. My frustration festered, fueling my closeness with Ezra. While I still told myself this was all innocent, my heart told a different story. Each conversation with him felt like unveiling a piece of my soul that had been dormant. One late afternoon, the museum was nearly empty, and a sudden downpour left me stranded without an umbrella. I was about to dash to my car when Ezra appeared, offering a big grin and a cheap fold-up umbrella he'd snagged from the lost and found box. We ended up sharing it, the cramped space forcing us to huddle close. Rain pelted the thin fabric. My arm brushed his, and I felt a spark that made me catch my breath. I tried to pass it off as static electricity or the chill of the rain, but we both knew the tension was real. He walked me to my car, both of us soaked from the knees down. I turned to thank him. The closeness, the pounding rain, the adrenaline, everything collided. Without warning, I leaned up and placed a brief, trembling kiss on his lips. It was a flash, a moment of insane courage or stupidity. My heart hammered so loudly I could barely hear. Ezra froze for half a second, then responded with equal fervor, the umbrella tipping dangerously, letting raindrops splatter us. We broke apart, breathing hard, eyes wide with shock at what we'd done. I mumbled an apology and dove into the car, fumbling the keys. By the time I shut the door, he was stepping back, umbrella still overhead, a mixture of awe and concern on his face. I peeled out of the parking lot, tears of guilt mingling with a strange, unstoppable exhilaration. Once home, I locked myself in the bathroom, staring at my reflection, whispering, "What have I done?" The guilt for betraying Daniel crushed me, yet I couldn't deny the racing pulse that reminded me I felt more alive in that stolen kiss than in my entire year so far. From that day on, everything changed. Ezra and I tried to talk about it, once the shock wore off. We agreed it was a mistake. He said he didn't want to complicate my marriage. He respected me too much. I insisted I loved my husband, that I couldn't cross more lines. Yet we found ourselves crossing them anyway, one by one. We'd linger after museum events, share quiet dinners, exchange texts about how we felt. Slowly, the physical boundary blurred. A hand held longer than necessary, a gentle touch on my cheek in a secluded hallway. Then came the deeper kisses, the hushed confessions of how we couldn't stand ignoring the pull between us. I started lying to Daniel more brazenly, claiming I had new museum duties or meeting up with old friends. Each falsehood weighed me down, but the moments with Ezra offered a rush of vitality that had been missing from my life for so long. We tried to keep it in check, telling ourselves we'd step back at any sign of someone catching on. But I was too enthralled, in too deep. Even in my darkest guilt, I found comfort in the warmth of his eyes, in the way he championed my dream of returning to art. Eventually, the museum workshops ended for the summer. I feared losing daily contact with him. We found excuses to meet, browsing an art store, visiting a quirky cafe, sometimes just driving around the city at dusk, sharing thoughts we'd never voiced to anyone else. Yet always, the threat of discovery loomed. I'd glance at my phone, see missed calls from Daniel, a spike of dread shooting through me. My heart told me I'd never truly leave my husband, but my soul craved the closeness I felt with Ezra. Daniel's suspicions weren't dormant. One evening, I returned home to find him in the living room, pacing. He confronted me. "Who is he?" At first I played dumb, but the panic in his voice made me falter. He'd found text messages on my phone, some chat about meeting at the Riverwalk, references to missing you. My blood turned cold. I tried to stutter an explanation, claiming it was just a friend from the museum, but the damage was done. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized the extent of my deception. He pressed for details. Who, how old, how long this had been going on. I broke down, sobbing, admitting only that I'd grown close to a volunteer, that lines were blurred. I couldn't bring myself to say his age, too ashamed. Daniel demanded to know if we'd slept together. I shook my head, admitting we'd been physically close, but not that far. The betrayal, though, was undeniable. Over the next hour, we had the most emotionally charged argument of our married life. Accusations, regrets, confessions. Eventually, Daniel slammed the door behind him, leaving me trembling on the kitchen floor. Tippy the cat circling my ankles, meowing in concern. Word spread at the museum that Daniel confronted me. I told Millie, in fragments, about my emotional spiral, how I'd never meant for this to happen. She was stunned, but offered no judgment, just caution. Meanwhile, Ezra texted in panic once he realized something was wrong, saying he'd do whatever I needed, back away or be there for me. I told him I couldn't think straight. Every minute felt surreal, like I was drifting through a haze of heartbreak. Daniel stayed with a friend for a while, refusing to see me unless necessary. We exchanged tense messages about bills, about picking up clothes. He demanded to know if I planned to continue seeing that kid, as he called Ezra. I had no clear answer, which only hurt him more. The confusion in my own head was overwhelming. I cared for Daniel, yet I realized how numb our marriage had become. I cared for Ezra, but how could we build anything from the ashes of betrayal? On nights I felt lost, I found myself texting Ezra for comfort, tears blurring my vision as I typed. It wasn't fair to him, but he insisted he didn't want me to go through this alone. We tried to meet in a park one late afternoon, me and Ezra, to figure out what next steps were possible. I arrived first, heart pounding with guilt, scanning for any sign of someone we might know. He showed up, looking pale, anxious. We strolled among the trees, voices low. He said he'd step aside if it would help me repair my marriage. Or if I needed him, he'd stay, but never wanted to push me into choosing. I found myself sobbing again, grateful for his empathy, yet crushed by the realization that I'd torn my life in two directions. The ring on my finger felt heavier with every breath. It's been 2 months since my world cracked open. I'm living alone in the house while Daniel rents a small apartment nearby, unsure if he wants to attempt marriage counseling or file for divorce. We had one session of therapy, which ended in him walking out, tears in his eyes. I'm trying to sort through who I am, what I truly want. Sometimes I meet Ezra for coffee or a walk. Our closeness remains undeniable, but so does the guilt. He offers me solace, yet I question whether I'm just clinging to the only warmth I have left. I can't say this story ends with a neat bow. Perhaps Daniel and I will reconcile, discovering new ways to connect. Perhaps I'll separate from him fully and see if a real relationship with Ezra can withstand the wreckage of its origin. Or perhaps I'll choose solitude, needing time to remember who I was before marriage and heartbreak overshadowed everything. All I know is that ignoring the silent discontent in my marriage led me here, into the arms of someone nearly half my age, stirring longing and shame in equal measure. If there's any moral, it's that unspoken loneliness can be as lethal as betrayal itself. It seeps into daily life until you grasp at the first flicker of light you see, whether or not it's wise. My name is Ramona, and this is my confession of how a few stolen moments of feeling truly alive threaten to unravel a lifetime of safety. I wish I could promise a tidy resolution, but for now, I hover between heartbreak and possibility, carrying the lessons of a desire I never expected to find, and the destructive power it unleashed.